The road up to Shiloh was steep, dusty, and crowded. Once a year, the hill country of Ephraim emptied out, but both of these assumptions miss the profound tragedy of his position. The opening verses of 1 Samuel introduce Elkanah as a man of impeccable religious pedigree. We crush them under a weight no mortal was designed to bear. Elkanah is a good husband, but he is a terrible substitute for the divine. His words, intended as a shield, only highlight Hannah's absolute isolation. If the man who loves her most believes that her tears are an insult to his affection, then nobody at this table truly understands her. The biblical text records no verbal answer from Hannah. She does not argue with him. She does not attempt to reassure his bruised ego or pretend to eat the meat to make him feel better. She realizes, in that exact moment, that relying on Elkanah's comfort is a dead end. His double portions and his well-meaning questions cannot reach the depth of her barrenness. If she stays at this table, she will only find more human limitations. So, she makes a physical movement that shifts the trajectory of biblical history. She stops trying to extract healing from human hands. The turning point of the entire narrative happens when Hannah pushes back from Elkanah's table. The text says simply, "After they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose." It is a quiet sentence, but it marks one of the most decisive movements in the biblical narrative. She does not argue with Elkanah's arrogance. He is an Ephraimite, a man of historical standing, and remarkably devout. During a period in Israel's history known for widespread spiritual darkness, corruption, she does not retaliate against Peninnah's cruelty. She simply stands up. She leaves the noise of the family feast. She leaves the double portion of meat untouched on her plate. And, most importantly, she leaves her husband's well-meaning but suffocating comfort behind. Hannah walks away from the firelight of the peace offering and moves toward the entrance of the tabernacle. This physical journey represents a profound spiritual shift. Up to this point, her story has been defined entirely by human actors. She has been trapped in a horizontal battle, bouncing between the cruelty of her rival and the inadequacy of her husband. But by walking into the sanctuary, Hannah fundamentally changes the axis of her crisis. She turns her agony vertically. This is the midpoint of the narrative, where the stakes escalate from a personal household tragedy to a crisis of national destiny. Hannah had to reach the absolute end of Elkanah's ability to comfort her before this shift could happen. As long as she looked to her husband to validate her pain, she was stuck at the table of human limitation. Only when Elkanah proved his inability to heal her could Hannah step into the space where divine intervention occurs. She trades the ceiling of human affection for the dust of the tabernacle floor. Inside the sanctuary, Hannah prays with such raw, violent intensity, and chaotic rebellion, the violent era of the judges. Elkanah is doing everything exactly right. He does not bow to the local Canaanite gods. That the high priest, Eli, mistakes her for a drunkard. The text tells us she was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. At the feast, Elkanah had demanded that she stop weeping so that he could feel successful in his love. In the presence of God, she is allowed to pour out her bitterness completely. She does not use polite, sanitized language. She addresses God with a fierce, unprecedented title, O Lord of hosts, Yahweh Sabaoth, the Lord of armies. She is not asking a distant deity for a small favor. She is calling on the sovereign commander of heaven's armies to intervene in her empty womb. Then, she makes the vow that will alter the course of Israel. If you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant, and remember me, and will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. Notice how the desire has been transformed. She is no longer asking for a son so she can parade him in front of Peninnah and finally win the courtyard war. She is not asking for an heir to secure her permanent status at Elkanah's table. She is asking for a son so she can immediately hand him back to God for the service of the nation. He faithfully travels to Shiloh year after year to offer sacrifices to the God of Israel. He is a steady provider, a protector. It is a breathtaking promise of surrender. The text notes that her face is no longer sad. But as Hannah finishes her silent prayer, wipes her face, and prepares to walk back to her family's camp, a massive obstacle remains. The sanctuary is quiet, but the ancient legal code is not. According to the strict laws of Israel, Hannah does not possess the independent authority to make this promise permanent. She has just promised away the firstborn son of the man who fiercely loves her. And, according to ancient law, when Hannah returns to her husband, her entire vow hangs by a single thread. Hannah walked back from the tabernacle to her family's camp. The heavy, suffocating despair that had crushed her for years was gone. The text notes that she finally ate, and her face was no longer sad. A profound spiritual transaction had occurred in the dark. But while her heart was settled, the legal reality of ancient Israel meant her vow was not yet secure. To understand the extreme vulnerability of Hannah's position, we have to turn to a specific, often ignored piece of legislation in the Torah. In Numbers chapter 30, Moses outlines the strict laws governing vows. In the patriarchal structure of the ancient world, a woman's vow could be legally nullified by the head of her household. If a wife made a binding promise to God, and a man who leads his family in worship, and yet, his home is an absolute war zone, this is the hidden contradiction at the heart. Her husband had the authority to void it. The law stated that if her husband heard of the vow and objected to it on that very day, he shall make void her vow which is on her, and the rash promise of her lips, and the Lord will forgive her. This legal detail dramatically raises the stakes of Hannah's prayer. She has not just offered her own future to the tabernacle. She has promised away the potential firstborn son of her husband. And not just any son, the long-awaited, desperately desired son of the woman Elkanah loves most in the world. Imagine the conversation that must have taken place when she returned to the tent. Legally, Elkanah held absolute veto power over her radical faith. He had every right to say, "Absolutely not. I have watched you weep for years. If God finally grants us a child, he belongs to our family. He stays in our home. I will not let you hand him over to Eli the priest." Culturally, no one would have blamed Elkanah for voiding the vow. In fact, his society would have expected it. But this is where Elkanah's character profoundly shifts. The biblical narrative does not record his verbal response to her vow, but his legal response is roaring in the background. According to Numbers 30, if a husband hears the vow of the narrative, the crisis we are about to witness does not happen in a rebellious, idol-worshipping family living in defiance of God, and says nothing. Then all her vows shall stand. By doing nothing, by remaining silent, Elkanah legally ratifies her promise. This is the hidden triumph of Elkanah. His greatest moment in the story is not his grand, public gesture with the double portion of meat. It is not his desperate attempt to be her savior at the table. His greatest act of love is his silent, agonizing submission to her faith. He stops trying to control the narrative of her grief. He lays down his legal right to her future child, realizing that her relationship with God has superseded his authority as a husband. The ceiling of human love is finally broken. Elkanah steps back, creating the space for God to answer her prayer on divine terms rather than human ones. The festival ends. The family returns to the hill country of Ephraim. The Lord remembers Hannah, and the son is finally born. She names him Samuel, meaning heard of God. But agreeing to surrender a hypothetical child in a moment of intense emotional clarity is one thing. Living out that vow is something else entirely. The boy is now a physical reality, laughing and growing in their courtyard. And as the time approaches for the next annual journey to Shiloh, the ultimate test of Elkanah's devotion is still waiting. The following spring, the festival of Shiloh returned. The roads filled again with families making the annual pilgrimage. It happens in the most religiously devoted household in the region. Elkanah loves his God, and he loves his wife profoundly. But inside Elkanah's household, the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. There was a baby in Hannah's arms. The agonizing silence of her womb had been broken by the sound of a crying infant. and the cruel dynamic of the courtyard was permanently altered. When the time came to pack the supplies and travel to the tabernacle, the biblical text records a surprising disruption. Elkanah prepares to leave, but Hannah refuses to go. She tells her husband, "I will not go up until the child is weaned. Then I will bring him, that he may appear in the presence of the Lord and remain there forever." In the ancient Near East, weaning was not a rapid process. It typically lasted 2 to 3 years. Hannah is essentially asking for a temporary suspension of her religious obligations so she can soak in every possible moment with her son before she gives him away. She is keenly aware that a clock is ticking every time she nurses him, every time he takes a clumsy step across the dusty floor. The day of his departure draws closer. How does Elkanah respond to this delay? A year earlier, at the sacrificial table, he had been anxious, controlling, but his religious obedience and his deep human affection are completely unable to heal her suffering. In fact, as the story unfolds, and desperate to fix her emotions, he had demanded that she stop weeping and look to him for her ultimate fulfillment. But the man standing in the courtyard now is not the same man who handed her the double portion of meat. Elkanah looks at his wife, holding the son he legally could have claimed for himself, and says, "Do what seems best to you. Wait until you have weaned him. Only, may the Lord establish his word." Notice the profound shift in his vocabulary. At the table of his own limitation, his focus was entirely internal and ego-driven. "Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" But now, his focus has shifted outward and upward. He does not center himself. He does not demand that she prove her love to him by traveling to the festival. Instead, he speaks a blessing of surrender. May the Lord establish his word. Elkanah has transitioned from trying to be the center of her universe to becoming a faithful facilitator of God's purpose. He recognizes that this child is not his trophy. He understands that the healing in his home was not produced by his protective affection, but by divine intervention. We will see that his desperate attempts to comfort her only isolate her further. The question is not whether Elkanah is a good man, and because he finally understands this, he gives Hannah the most agonizing, beautiful gift a husband could offer in this situation: time. He goes to Shiloh without her. For the next 3 years, he walks the dusty road, leaving his primary love and his miraculous son behind, allowing Hannah to fulfill the grueling, beautiful work of nursing a child she is preparing to release. Elkanah has learned the hardest lesson of human devotion. True love does not always mean pulling someone closer to protect them. Sometimes, it means giving them the space they need to obey God. But the 3 years do not last forever. The physical dependence of the child ends. The weaning is finished. The delay is over. The day of the hardest journey finally arrives. The family gathers their supplies, steps out of the courtyard, and begins to walk the road to Shiloh one more time. The road up to Shiloh was steep, dusty, and crowded, just as it had been 3 years earlier. The festival air still smelled of wood smoke and roasted meat, but as Elkanah and Hannah walked the ancient path this time, the crushing weight of their previous journeys was gone. They were not walking into a war zone of family cruelty. They were walking into a holy surrender. When they arrived at the sanctuary, the question is, why his genuine, protective love is entirely insufficient to stop Hannah's pain. We often read this passage as a simple lesson. The contrast with the opening scene was absolute. 3 years ago, Elkanah had sat at the festival table, desperately carving a double portion of meat to shield his wife from her grief. He had tried to be her savior, offering his own affection to cure an agony he did not truly understand. But look at the sacrifice they bring now. The biblical text tells us they did not come to the table looking for comfort. They brought a massive offering, a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine. And most importantly, they brought the boy. Elkanah does not hand Hannah a compensating portion of meat to make her smile. He steps back in complete silence. He fades entirely into the background of the biblical text, never to speak again. As Hannah takes the lead, She holds the child she had begged for, walks up to Eli the priest, and says, "For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord." This is not ultimately a story about a dysfunctional ancient marriage. It is a story about the transition from the limitations of human devotion to the necessity of divine intervention. It is the painful, beautiful realization that the ceiling of human love must eventually be broken so that God's purpose can enter. This story forces us to look in the mirror and ask a difficult question. Are you carrying the exhausting burden of trying to be Elkanah, as families made the slow pilgrimage to the tabernacle of the Lord? It was a time of national celebration, a festival marked by roasted meat, about how to pray when we are hurting. But before, it is a story about prayer. It is a story about the ceiling of human affection. Are you desperately trying to be the savior for someone else's grief? We often offer our own versions of the double portion, our advice, our money, our constant hovering, our frantic attempts to make them smile, and we feel bruised and resentful when our love is not enough to heal their depression, their anxiety, or their profound loss. We ask, in our own subtle ways, "Am I not enough for you?" Or perhaps you are sitting in Hannah's seat. Perhaps you are demanding that a spouse, a friend, or a parent heal an existential barrenness inside you that no mortal was designed to fix. Elkanah's story teaches us that human love is a beautiful gift, but it is a terrible god. He reached his highest potential not when he tried to aggressively fix his wife's pain, but when he laid down his right to control her future and gave her the space to encounter God. True love sometimes means stepping back. It means realizing that the greatest thing you can do for someone in deep agony is not to hand them another portion from your own table, but to walk with them to the sanctuary and let them speak to the Lord of armies. Elkanah finally stopped trying to be the answer, and in the quiet space he left behind, a prophet was born. It is a portrait of a husband who attempts to be the savior of his wife's grief, only to discover that human love, even at its absolute best, cannot cure a spiritual barrenness that God is preparing to fill. Elkanah represents that terrifying moment in life when we realize that the people who love us most simply cannot fix our deepest pain. To understand why his best efforts fail so completely, and why this annual journey is so agonizing, we cannot just look at his good intentions. We have to look at the architecture of his family. The noise and cruelty on this dusty road did not begin at the sanctuary. It was built into the very walls of his home. The walls of Elkanah's home were constructed around a social reality that modern readers often struggle to understand. The writer of 1 Samuel introduces the household with a blunt, factual statement. He had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other, Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. For a contemporary audience, this arrangement immediately feels like a moral failure. We assume Elkanah's polygamy was driven by unchecked ancient male desire, communal singing, and the thick smell of wood smoke drifting over the ancient sanctuary. But inside one particular family walking this road, the atmosphere was suffocating, a patriarchal luxury that fractured his home. But in the ancient Near East, a household like this was rarely built on romance. It was built on survival. In the ancient agrarian world, a family without an heir faced absolute disaster. Children were not just an emotional desire. They were the economic engine of the family, the social security for aging parents, and the sole guarantee that a family's land and name would survive into the next generation. If a primary wife was barren, it was a recognized cultural custom and sometimes a societal expectation for a husband to take a second wife specifically to provide offspring. We see this pattern throughout the patriarchs, from Abraham and Hagar to Jacob and his wives. This historical reality changes how we view Elkanah's marriage. Every indication in the text suggests his heart belonged entirely to Hannah. She was his first choice, his primary love. Peninnah was almost certainly a secondary addition, brought into the home as a practical solution to a biological problem. But a solution on paper rarely translates cleanly into the human heart. The arrangement, created a devastating psychological trap for everyone involved. Peninnah provided the children, but she knew she did not possess Elkanah's deepest affections. She was a biological necessity, not his true love. Hannah, on the other hand, possessed her husband's heart, but she could not provide the one thing the culture demanded of her. There was no celebration. There was only a quiet, bleeding grief, and a husband trying desperately to manage the tension. It was a perfect recipe for mutual torment. Peninnah weaponized her fertility to compensate for her lack of love. Hannah internalized her barrenness, crushed by the weight of her cultural shame. Imagine the daily reality in that ancient courtyard. The living space would have been intimate, the walls close. Every day, Hannah had to hear the sound of Peninnah's children playing, laughing, and asking for bread. Every birth announcement, every weaning feast, every child's milestone was a physical reminder of Hannah's empty arms. The biblical writer does not use soft language to describe this dynamic. The text calls Peninnah her rival, translating a Hebrew word that literally means an adversary, an oppressor, or someone who causes acute distress. Elkanah's attempt to secure his lineage had built an inescapable emotional prison. His wives were locked in a bitter struggle for validation, and there was no way to pause the conflict. They lived together, they ate together, and every year, they traveled together. The journey to Shiloh should have been a time of spiritual renewal. Instead, it was the most agonizing week of the year. The festival required the entire family to sit together at a public sacrificial meal. The private courtyard war was suddenly placed on a public stage, where Peninnah's abundant children would be visible for the entire community to see. Most readers of the Hebrew Bible know the story of Hannah. We know her tears, her silent prayer in the tabernacle, and the eventual birth of her son. Elkanah knew the tension was unbearable. He knew his second wife would use the religious festival to twist the knife. But he had a strategy to manage the cruelty during the most important feast of the year. When the family arrived at the sanctuary, Elkanah attempted to fix the unfixable. The tabernacle at Shiloh was not a place of quiet, solitary reflection. It was loud, crowded, and deeply communal. At the climax of the annual pilgrimage, families gathered to eat the peace offering. This was a sacred feast where the worshiper, the priest, and God symbolically shared a meal together. As the head of the household, Elkanah held the knife. It was his responsibility to distribute the roasted meat to his family. The text tells us that he gave portions to Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. It was a visible, undeniable display of her fertility. One by one, plates were filled, and Peninnah's side of the table grew loud with the chaotic energy of a large, growing family. Then Elkanah turned to Hannah. He saw her isolation. He felt the weight of the cultural shame pressing down on her shoulders. And so, he attempted to build a shield around her, using the only tool he had available at the table, Samuel, who would become one of Israel's greatest prophets. But standing right behind Hannah is a man who is often overlooked, or worse, entirely misunderstood. First Samuel states, "But to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb." The Hebrew phrase used here is famously difficult. The text literally says, "He gave her mana ahat apayim." Some scholars translate this as a double portion. Others render it as a worthy portion, a choice portion, or the best part of the meat. While translators debate the precise etymology, the physical reality in the ancient world was unmistakable. Elkanah was giving Hannah the seat of honor. He was publicly elevating her above Peninnah. He was using his authority to declare to the entire community, "She is the one I truly love." It was a beautiful, tender gesture. It was also completely disastrous. Elkanah believed his public display of affection would insulate Hannah from her grief. Instead, his protection created her persecution. Consider the psychology of the table. Peninnah was already trapped in a marriage, where she was defined only by her biological output. Watching Elkanah deliberately hand the choicest, the largest piece of meat to the barren wife was a devastating humiliation. In the brutal economy of this household, Peninnah retaliated with the only weapon she had. The biblical writer notes that her rival used this exact moment. His name is Elkanah. When Elkanah is mentioned in modern studies, he is usually cast into one of two extreme categories: to provoke Hannah severely, to irritate her. The Hebrew root used here for irritation implies a violent, emotional shaking. Peninnah did not merely tease Hannah. She targeted her deepest vulnerability and verbally attacked her until Hannah trembled. And Peninnah did this year after year, turning the sacred meal into a recurring trauma. Elkanah's strategy backfired completely. By trying to compensate for Hannah's empty arms with a heavier plate, he poured fuel on Peninnah's resentment. He turned a private family tension into a public spectacle. The result was absolute heartbreak. The text says, Hannah wept and would not eat. The very portion of meat Elkanah had carved to comfort her sat untouched. His material gift was powerless against her spiritual agony. You cannot fix a closed womb with a full plate. Elkanah watched his wife break down in tears. His grand gesture had failed. The noise of Peninnah's children surrounded them, and Hannah was weeping at a festival meant for joy. Finally, unable to endure her grief any longer, Elkanah leaned over the table and spoke. But his words did not bring healing. Instead, they revealed a devastating blind spot. He asked a question that remains one of the most famous and most misunderstood lines in the entire story. Some view him as a passive, detached ancient patriarch, a man who sits by comfortably while his second wife relentlessly torments his first. The noise of the festival was deafening. Families were laughing. Priests were moving through the crowds. And the thick smoke of the peace offerings drifted over Shiloh. But at Elkanah's table, the celebration had collapsed. Hannah was trembling. The choicest portion of meat sat untouched on her plate, and Peninnah's cruel provocations hung in the air. Elkanah could not stand it anymore. He leaned across the table and fired 4 rapid, desperate questions. Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? On the surface, this sounds like the tender plea of a devoted husband. He hates seeing his wife in pain. He wants to pull her out of her despair and remind her that she is secure, that she is valued, and that she possesses his entire heart. But beneath the genuine affection, there is a subtle, devastating arrogance. Look carefully at the measurement Elkanah uses to comfort her. In the ancient Near East, 10 sons was not just a random number. It was the idiomatic expression for perfect familial fulfillment. It represented the ultimate cultural blessing, the highest level of security, and the complete absence of shame. By asking, "Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" Elkanah is placing his own romantic devotion. Others view him as the ultimate romantic ideal, the tender, affectionate husband whose love should have been enough to make Hannah happy on a scale against her profound physical, social, and spiritual crisis. He is essentially saying, "Does my love not outweigh your tragedy? Am I not enough for you?" This is where Elkanah hits the absolute ceiling of human limitation. He believes he can be her savior. He misunderstands the nature of her grief entirely. Assuming she is crying because she feels unloved or insecure in the marriage, he centers himself in her tragedy, demanding that his presence be the remedy for an existential void he cannot possibly fill. This is the tragic flaw of human devotion, and it is a pattern that repeats in our own lives. We often do exactly what Elkanah did. We see someone we love suffering deeply, and instead of sitting with them in the dark, we try to fix the unfixable by offering ourselves as the cure. We make their grief a referendum on our own love. We subtly demand that they stop hurting so that we can feel successful in our ability to comfort them. But human love is a beautiful gift and a terrible God. When we expect another human being to be the answer to our deepest spiritual agony, or when we arrogantly assume our affection should erase someone else's brokenness,